Well, good morning, everybody, or afternoon or evening, as the case may be. I just want to fill in something left over from last week, so it'll give time in case we have any latecomers. Arguably, just as Yaakov's dream of the Sulam and the Malachim is arguably the featured most prominent part of Parashat Vayetze, then just as arguably his struggle with whomever he struggled was the most prominent feature of Parashat Vayishlach. So I actually looked through a variety of Piyutim to see if anybody had devoted a Piyut specifically to the wrestling match between Yaakov and his opponent. And the best that I could come up with was that there was such a Piyut, but it was too fragmented. That is to say, not enough of it was preserved to be able to, to do a decent reconstruction. So I actually asked AI to reconstruct it, and it came up with a reasonably credible reconstruction on the surface. Problem is that, as it often or frequently does, it cites sources, and my inveterate procedure is to validate, to verify those sources. And I couldn't, meaning it claimed to be reconstructing the Piyut on the basis of Geniza fragments, and it listed several Geniza fragments that it had drawn from. And there is a database, an accessible database of just about all the extant Geniza fragments, and I checked the ones that it cited as its authority, and as we say in Latin, nicht gesteugen, nicht geflogen. They just simply weren't there. Now, it could be that this is what in the business they call a hallucination. That's when artificial intelligence puts together 2 and 2 and comes up with something other than 4. On the other hand, it could be that it was citing a source, and the source was mistaken. So I decided that the better part of valor was to simply let it go. So that's why we didn't do anything last week that was specific to the Ne'evak of Yaakov's struggle. Now, for the same reason today, arguably the featured most prominent part of Parashat Vayeshev is Mechirat Yosef. So we will indeed be looking at that. And since we've given a couple of extra minutes for people to come on board, let me start with something that isn't in the source sheets. It's just by way of introduction. Okay, so I don't know whether you have a prior acquaintance with this website. It's called Al HaTorah, and it is a magnificent website. It is basically created and maintained by one person and his family. Rabbi Dr. Hillel Novetsky and his family in Jerusalem created this site, and they single-handedly maintain it. I can't tell you who sustains it, because obviously that's a different question. But it basically, its core is a Mikraot Gedolot. That is to say, it is the full Masoretic text of Tanakh, the Masoretic text itself being checked against those that are considered to be the most authoritative, and a vast array of commentaries and translations, ranging from as venerable as Targum Onkelos to as recent as David Tzvi Hoffman. That is to say, it spans pretty much the better part of 2,000 years. And in addition to the texts of the Perushim themselves, which again are checked against the most reliable manuscripts and printed editions, it also contains, in many cases, English translations of those sources. So it is a remarkable website, alhatorah.org, as you can see it in the upper left-hand corner of the screen. And I just want to call our attention to one portion of it today. I'm going to highlight it now so that you can easily draw your attention to it. As you see, it's contained within the commentary of Rashi. However, as you can also see, it is enclosed in square brackets. That is to indicate that while this text appears in most of the editions of Rashi, manuscripts and printed editions alike, there are substantial reasons in which to question whether it is an original part of Rashi or whether, like many things, it was added to the commentary of Rashi, either in some cases by one of his students, or as in many cases by a later copyist or an even later printer. That's not to question its authenticity, because what it is in essence is basically a paraphrase of a Midrash Rabbah. Okay, so the question isn't whether this is genuine or not. It's only a question of whether it's an original part of Rashi's commentary. So basically what has drawn Rashi's attention here, or the Midrash's attention here, is to the pasuk, the second pasuk in this coming week's Torah reading, which begins Ele Toldot Yaakov, and that leads us to anticipate that it's going to give us the names of all of Yaakov's children. After all, in the past, we've had the Toledot of Noach, we've had the Toledot of Avraham, we've had the Toledot of Yitzchak. Just at the very end of last week's Parsha, we had the extensive Toledot of Esav. And in every case, Toledot basically is an introduction to a genealogical list. So we would expect to find the names of Yaakov's sons, and yet surprisingly, it says Ela Toldot Yaakov, Yosef, as though all we needed to know or wanted to know about Yaakov has to do with Yosef. So it is in addressing this oddity that the Midrash says as follows, and it's a famous Midrash. Bikesh Yaakov leishev shalva. Yaakov Avinu wanted nothing more than to live in tranquility. But what happened? Kafatz alav rugzo shel Yosef. That his tranquility was rudely interrupted by the events surrounding Yosef. Okay? And indeed, as I said, this is a paraphrase of a Midrash Rabbah, and I use it simply as an introduction to justify the comment with which I began, and that namely that the most prominent feature of this week's Torah portion is the episode surrounding Mechirat Yosef, and therefore that is what is going to draw the attention of the Paitanim. So with that, let me open to the Piyut itself, and now we're back on the source sheet. Okay, so this week I have an opportunity to introduce us to another Paitan, a very significant paitan, almost the father of Piyut. You'll see in the opening paragraph, the second line, sometimes referred to as the father of Piyut. He wasn't the first paitan. We know of at least one other paitan who preceded him, and that paitan is known by the name of Yossi ben Yossi, who seemed to have lived, as well as this paitan, in the land of Israel, somewheres in the late 5th, early 6th century. This paitan goes by the name of Yanai, usually spelled in Hebrew with two yuds, although a more conventional spelling of it, as it is Yud Nun Aleph Yud. We can see, and we will see indeed today, the way he signs his name in an acrostic. He spelled it Yud Nun Yud Yud. Okay, and the reason that he's referred to as the father of Piyut, even though he was not historically the first paitan, is because he adopted a style of Piyut that subsequently became pretty much the standard. Okay? As you can read here in the 4th line, he was the first paitan to sign his name in an acrostic. He was the first to use end rhyme, right, to have the lines in the Piyut rhyme with each other. And again, the first to not just write Piyutim for the Yamim HaNoraim or for the Shalosh Regalim, but the first to also compose Piyutim for weekly services, as it says, that is to say, for ordinary Shabbatot. And again, as with most of the Paitanim that we have already visited, his Piyutim were made to be incorporated into the liturgy, and more specifically to accompany the Kedusha of Shacharit. And therefore, as you see in the middle paragraph, that again, he was the author of many Kiddush Ta'ot. Kiddush Ta, again, a poem intended for the Shacharit service of Shabbat, incorporated into one of the three of the first brachot of the Amidah, the ones anticipating the Kedusha. And he also composed Piyutim specifically for the Musaf of Shabbatot and Chagim. And since the distinguishing feature of the Musaf of Shabbat and of the Shalosh Regalim, not of Rosh Hashanah, however, is that it consists of 7 brachot, right? The first and last 3 brachot are invariable. Okay, they're the same whether it's Tuesday or whether it's Saturday or whether it's Yom HaKippurim, right? It's a question of how many and which brachot come in the middle. On an ordinary Shabbat and on an ordinary regel, there is only one middle bracha. Okay, on Shabbat, of course, it's the bracha of Mekadesh HaShabbat. And on the Shalosh Regalim, it's the bracha of Mekadesh Yisrael V'Hazmanim. So a piyut that was designed to be incorporated as part of this 7th bracha on Shabbat or Yom Tov was called a Shiv'ata, again from the Aramaic for 7. Okay, I'll skip the 3rd paragraph. It's just a bit of folklore. There was a legend that got around in the Middle Ages that somehow Yanai was jealous of one of his students, a student named Eliezer, and that he actually contrived to kill his student out of jealousy. That, like many medieval legends, really does not withstand historical scrutiny. But it's there anyways because it's part of the conventional wisdom surrounding Yanai. The student, I'll highlight the name here, will come to him unquestionably, probably sooner rather than later, because amongst the early Paitanim, that is to say, the ones who lived in the land of Israel during the Byzantine era, that would be again somewhere between the 4th and the 7th centuries, he was perhaps the most prolific, and also addressed some, apart from writing liturgical poems, it would appear that he also wrote poems on the occasions of certain historical events. So we will take that up separately. But again, so the paitan du jour, so to speak, is Yanai. And to reacquaint you with Yanai, just simply to point out to you that you've probably been acquainted with at least one of Yanai's piyutim, though you may not have been aware of the fact that he was its author. So I call your attention here to one of the popular piyutim of the Haggadah. Okay, part of the Nirtzah, the closing portion of the Seder, consists of piyutim. And one of those piyutim, as you see, is called Uvechein Vayihi Bachatzi Halayla. And so it was at midnight. And as you see, this is an alphabetic acrostic, right? The first stanza covers the letters Aleph, Bet, Gimel. The second stanza covers the letters Dalet, Hey, Vav. I only brought the first two stanzas, okay? So again, just to go over it as a way, again, as if reacquainting ourselves with Yanai, and again, getting a sense of what he was doing. So Az, that is to say, Az being Bachatzi Halayla, at midnight, Rov Nisim Hifleta Balayla, that God accomplished numerous miracles. Barosh Ashmoret Ze Halayla, the Ashmorot were the different times of the night at which the watch would be replaced, right? Not the timepiece watch, but soldiers who are on guard. Okay, Ger Tzedek Nitzachto Kenechlak Lo Laila. Ger Tzedek is Avraham Avinu, right? Who was arguably the only one of the Avot to have to convert. Right? Arguably, Yitzchak and Yaakov were already born Jewish. Okay, Avraham Avinu was not born Jewish, and therefore he was the original Ger Tzedek, the original righteous convert. Nitzachto, that is to say that you gave him the opportunity to be victorious. Kinechlak lo laila. What is kinechlak lo laila? So you see, matching colors, the pasuk in Breshith that describes the manner in which Avraham and his team caught up with and defeated the Mesopotamian marauders who had taken his nephew Lot captive. And it says, Vayechalek alehem laila. Now, the pshat of Vayechalek alehem laila is that Avraham divided his forces into separate parts. That is to say, that he attacked from two directions. Okay? The Paitan seems to imply that Vayechalek alehem laila means that he somehow managed to split the night. Now, exactly what that would mean, would this be something like Yehoshua causing the sun to stand still, or something like that, or is it just simply a poetic license? In any event, second stanza, Danta, that is to say that you administer justice to Melech Grar, that would be Avimelech, the king of the Philistines. Bachalom Laila, as God appeared to him in a dream. Hivchadeta Arami be'emesh Laila, that God protected Avraham and Yitzchak from Avimelech by warning Avimelech in a dream not to harm them, just as he warned Lavan, the Arami, in a dream not to harm Yaakov. Vayasar Yisrael Malach, and Yaakov Avinu, who on account of this struggle came to be known as Yisrael. So he overcame this Malach, and again you see that he's taking the Midrashic view that the Ish was actually an angel. Vayuchalo, and he overcame him Laila, at night. And again, this is how it continues. So as I said, this is just to reassure us that although we may not have known it, we were already familiar with Yanai as a Paitan. And with that, let's go specifically to a piyut that was intended for Parashat Vayeshev. I'll make it just a slightly bit larger. Okay. Reads as follows. First of all, notice again that it is an alphabetic acrostic. Okay. As a matter of fact, you can see all together here on one page the entire alphabet. Okay. Line 1 has the Aleph Bet, line 2, Gimel Dalet, and then continuing again, each line split in half beginning with a new letter of the Aleph Bet. And once again, the unvocalized texts are psukim that again were incorporated into the Piyut at certain junctures because they were the segue into the brachot of the Amidah that the Piyut was intended to accompany. So he speaks about God and says, Ata, you, God, Omer v'oseh. Okay? You don't only talk a good line, right? You also act. You deliver on your promises. Bi'ur ma'amarach ma'aseh. Right? When God makes a promise, the effect of it, right, the realization of it is ma'aseh, is an action. Okay? And that is displayed in God's relationship with the Avot. Gever asher bach yecheseh, a person who places his trust in God, devarach bo, whatever it is that God says to that person, yakum v'ye'aseh, will certainly be brought into fruition or into fulfillment. And here we get some examples. Hivtachta ha'aretz, you promised the land of Israel, limlut kibshan esh, right, to the one who escaped the furnace. Is curious one, just a parenthesis, okay? Biblically, who escaped from a furnace? Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. That is to say, Daniel's 3 companions who were thrown into the furnace by the Babylonians and emerged unscathed. Okay. But clearly they're not the objects here of this piyut because they were not promised anything by God, so to speak. Okay. Obviously, again, the piyutan is looking at the Torah through a midrashic lens. And the Melut Kibshan Ha'esh here is clearly Avraham Avinu, about whom nothing regarding the Kibshan Eish is said in the Torah per se, but yet it is a prominent feature of the Agadah. So again, God made this promise to Avraham, okay? Vehechezeta, God similarly made the land a place of machaseh, a place of shelter. L'ne'ekad b'mizbach eish, to one who was tied onto a mizbeach, that would be Yitzchak Avinu. Zimanta l'ne'evak imsar eish, you promised, you intended the land of Israel to whomever it was who struggled with a fiery angel, which would be Yaakov Avinu, okay? Chanaba, and therefore, in this land that was promised to the Avot, Chanaba, it became the place of residence, who, that is to say, Yaakov, Uveito, and his descendants, Hamashul Ba'esh, who are compared to a flame. You may remember this from last week's Piyut. We compared last week's Piyut to the Haftarah, okay, to the book of Ovadia, in which Ovadia, looking into the future and forecasting a future struggle between the descendants of Yaakov and the descendants of Edom, of Esav, says as follows, Vaya bet Yaakov Eish, right, ubet Yosef lehava. He compares, if you recall, the descendants of Esav and Edom to straw, and the descendants of Yaakov and Yosef to a flame. And clearly when you put a flame to straw, right, then it destroys it entirely. So this reference here to Beito HaMashul Ba'esh, his family, which is compared to a flame, that again is an allusion to the Nevuah of Ovadia. The next line is a little difficult. Tov brachot hishavto, you drew on his behalf, on the behalf of Yaakov or on the behalf of his descendants, you, as it were, drew from the well of blessing, right? Brachot, okay? The balance of it clearly just simply doesn't remain. Ka'et, at a juncture, asher b'shalom heshavto, at whatever juncture in time you returned him home in peace, lavetach ba hoshavto, and you enabled him to take up residence there again in the land of Israel peacefully. Now, see, we know what's following. We know that the other shoe, so to speak, is about to drop, because we saw that in the Midrash that was incorporated into the commentary of Rashi. That it begins with Bikesh Yaakov Avinu leishev bishalva, right? That Yaakov, having returned home safely from his sojourn with Lavan, is seeking nothing more than peace and quiet. Kafatz alav rugzo shel Yosef, but that peace and quiet is going to be rudely and sorely interrupted. So we kind of get a sense of what is about to follow. So indeed, this is pretty much a point at which he interrupts the Piyut in order to incorporate a couple of psukim. Vayeshev Yaakov b'eretz migurei aviv b'eretz Canaan, right? And lemor lecha ten eretz Canaan chevel nachalatchem biotchem etem mispar kimat v'garim ba, which you may recognize from the daily Shacharit. It's from Divrei Hayamim. So what we have here, again, are psukim that follow up on the theme of how Yaakov Avinu was intent upon taking up peaceful residence in the land of Israel. But it concludes with Ba, in the land, Tita'enu, we ask God to implant us in the land, Umenna, and from the land of Israel, Baal Tata'enu, don't lead us out, don't lead us astray. And again, something again to that effect, and it concludes with the bracha of Magen Avraham. And then it picks up again with the letter Mem. Makom asher yashavu achim, right? The land of Canaan, in which both Yaakov and Esav had taken up residence. Nitan kitata ben achim, right? Now, there's a curious thing. Yaakov and Esav somehow managed to exist, to coexist peacefully in the land of Canaan, while in contrast, there was ktata ben achim, there was struggle amongst brothers, not Yaakov and Esav in this case, but Yosef and his brothers. So in a sense, he's drawing a very interesting contrast here. Right? Yaakov had every reason to be wary of Esav, and yet somehow they coexisted. Yaakov could not have anticipated that there would be such a struggle amongst his own children that it would lead eventually, as we know, to Mechirat Yosef. Sach tov v'na'im mavor echav nachim. Again, there's not enough of the text to make complete sense of it. But the concluding lines are all there. Pu'ulat ma'alalehem hara'im, the effect of their evil intentions, tzon be'et hayuroim, was that on an instance in which they were out in the fields tending to the sheep, koshet lifnei av hineim, rak hanikar b'ma'alalav ki na'im. Now, Yosef, right, spoke his dreams to his father, and his dreams came true. Koshet is the Aramaic word for truth. So koshet lifnei av hineim, that Yaakov, when Yosef told his dreams to his father, he was telling his father something that was eventually going to be proven true. Rak hanikar b'ma'alalav ki na'im. However, things turned out differently. Shafalu b'nei imahot. Okay. This is referring now to the different children of Yaakov from his different wives. The b'nei imahot are the children of Rachel and Leah. Okay. And in the dream, Yosef saw them bowing down to him. Shafel is to lower. So shafelu b'nei imahot, the focus of the dream was to see the sons of Rachel and Leah being lower than Yosef. Shachu b'nei Ammahot. The children of the Ammahot are the children of Bilhah and Zilpah, and they also in the dream are bowing to Yosef. Shachu is from the same word as lehishtachavot. So again, the substance of the dream was basically for Yosef to see all of his brothers bowing down to him. Okay. Temur kimatsui kan liyaladot or yaldot takaf v'nit yaches rosh litoladot. I tell you in all honesty, I've worked at this. I don't really know exactly. I'll take a shot at it. By the way, the notes on the bottom of this page are not explanatory notes, as they have been in many of the previous cases. They're textual notes. Okay, I did not find a published commentary on this Piyut, so basically just trying to work it out myself. Temur is in exchange of. Okay, Temur in exchange, kimatsui, there is found. Kain is a nest. Li yaldut, yaladot, yaldut. I'm not sure what it means. Takef is to strengthen. Nityaches is to establish a connection. Rosh letoladot. Now I know what the Rosh letoladot is. The Rosh letoladot is the person whose name appears in the pasuk right after Ele Toldot Yaakov. And you remember what sparked the Midrash and Rashi's interest in the pasuk in the first place was that Ele Toldot Yaakov leads us to expect a list of all of his children. And instead, somewhat oddly, we get only Yosef. Okay, so I know that the Rosh Letoladot is a reference to Yosef, because Yosef was the first, and indeed the only one of Yaakov's children to be mentioned here by name. But let's just move on to the conclusion of it. Okay, and in the conclusion, you can see, first there's again a liturgical insert for the bracha Mechayeh HaMeitim. Hofi'am mimromim, we call upon God to appear to us from on high. Aleinu barachamim, and to appear to us compassionately. Vahatlil, from the word tal meaning do, tchiyat ridumim. You may remember from our examination of Piyutim apropos of Akedat Yitzchak, that according to the Midrash, the instrument with which God is going to resurrect the dead, and which according to some medieval midrashim was the instrument with which God brought Yitzchak back to life after Avraham took his life. Right? Remember that was just a medieval legend, so to speak, that attached itself to some of the events surrounding the First Crusade in 1096. Okay. So according to the Midrash, again, the instrument of Tchiyat HaMeitim is dew, is tal. So Vahatlil, Tchiyat Ridumim, is calling upon God to use tal as an instrument to bring back to life Ridumim, those who are asleep. Not sleep in the sense of the sleep from which you awaken, but a sleep from which you don't awaken. And the concluding stanza is the one that spells out his name. You can see again the acrostic, the first letter of each line, Yud, Nun, Yud, Yud, spelling out Yanai. Yeshivat Manoach, a peaceful existence, going back again to that opening Midrash. As lo matzanu, right? We weren't able to live in tranquility. B'chol haratzot asher yatzanu, and indeed throughout our history, we've never found a place in which we were completely at rest. Nidminu, we can be compared, li'ishtam, again remember is that the biblical description of Yaakov, asher yashav b'moshvotav, who took up residence right, in the land of Canaan. Vata'olel ayin b'noy yeshivotenu, and again, was simply unable to sustain it. Yeshiva ein l'shivtei zera tzadik. And just as Yaakov was not able to find that tranquility, so have his descendants been unable to live in peace. Ad, until, and here I've highlighted it, ad yifra'u. Lifroa is to repay a loan, to repay a debt, okay? Ad yifra'u kesef, until they repay the debt asher machru tzadik. There seems to be a suggestion here that Mechirat Yosef is somehow a cause of galut, a cause of the Jewish people living in exile. Yavo'u v'yashuvu, ultimately they will be able to return. Va'od lo yum shavu, and they will not be, as it were, blown about by the wind. Okay. Ki b'nevei shalom yeshvu v'yityashavu, but ultimately they will be able to find that tranquility. And again, he closes with a verse, Vayeshev v'yashavi mi b'nevei shalom v'mishkenot mivtachim u'v'mnuchat sha'ananot v'yeshvu al admatam. That again, this is a forecast for the eschatological future. And it concludes with the bracha of Atakadosh, and that's the conclusion of the Piyut. But simply to show that Yanai is not alone in intimating, it's more than an intimation, in declaring that Mechirat Yosef is somehow a debt that the Jewish people has incurred, and which it has not, even till this day being at least the 6th, 7th century of Yanai, right? That it is a debt that even in the early Middle Ages still had not been repaid in full, is a theme that recurs in the Talmud, in the Midrash, and in other elements of medieval Piyut. And here is just simply a selection of pertinent sources. Starting with a Midrash Tehillim, which is not one of the Tanaitic Midrashim, but is yet still a reasonably early Midrash. Amar Rabbi Chanain, Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu Lashvatim. God said as follows to Yosef's brothers, Atem mechartem oto le'eved. You sold your brother into slavery. Shene Emar. And how does God know that? Because it says in his Torah, Le'eved nimkar Yosef, okay. Chayechem, that's the language of an oath, right? God, as it is, swears an oath to the brothers. She'atem korim b'chol shana avadim hayinu lefaro b'mitzrayim. So again, the suggestion that part of the slavery and oppression that we suffered in Egypt was a consequence of Mechirat Yosef. And it appears in yet another Piyut of Eliezer Kalir, whom we mentioned at the outset, was a student of Yanai. And you see the small selection here. Again, if you want to see, the first line starts with a pei, the third line starts with a tzadi. So again, this is an excerpt from, again, an alphabetic acrostic. Pochazim, the bad guys, sechavuni, they dragged me, vihigluni, and they sent me into exile, bamdinot lehimacher, so that I was sold into slavery. Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, right, the leaders of the Jewish people, so the first line is clearly talking about the Babylonian exile. So the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, who were the leaders of the Jewish people in the land of Israel at the beginning of the Second Temple period, Peira'on kalkol achar, they tried to pay off the debt incurred by the sale of Yosef. Okay, Peira'on, again, remember we saw it previously, is to repay a loan or to repay a debt. Kalkol is a a midrashic epithet, which is attached to Yosef, based on the fact that the Torah tells us about Yosef, and you can see the line below it, kalkol ze Yosef, al shem, based on the verse, vayechalkel Yosef et aviv et echav, that since Yosef was the one who sustained his family in Egypt, so kalkol means the sustainer. Tze'umi Bavel, okay, that is to say, either the Jews who were exiled to Babylonia, right, were seeking their repatriation. Okay, Yashmiya, the call will be issued. Eit yikara shtarcho v'lo yizacher, meaning when will Jews be redeemed from their exile? When the debt is paid. And what is the debt? He reminds us, kinifra kesef tzadik v'nifda hamimkar. And again, the suggestion that the sale of Yosef is somehow responsible, we saw initially in the Midrash, for the slavery and oppression in Egypt, and now he extends it to other instances in which the Jewish people were exiled from their land. Only on account of the constraints of time, I'm going to skip now to the best-known source of this association between the sale of Yosef and Jewish suffering, comes from a medieval midrash called the Midrash of Eila Ezkara. Now, you may recognize it because it is incorporated into the keynote of Tisha B'Av, and it's also incorporated into the Selichot of Musaf of Yom Kippurim. And we know it primarily in this version that I'll get to in a moment as a Piyut called Eila Ezkara, right? But the source of the Piyut Eila Ezkara appears to be in the Midrash Eila Ezkara. So I just want to look at the Midrash quickly before we look at the Piyut itself. So the Midrash says as follows: Nisa'o haruach, the wind, as it were, transported him. It happens to be referring to Rabbi Yishmael, who was the Kohen Gadol, and Hevio lema'ala ad harakia hashishi, and it somehow transported him into heaven. Upagavo Gabriel hamalach, where he encountered the angel Gabriel. Amarlo, Gabriel said to him, Lama alita b'chan, what you doing here? And Rabbi Yishmael answers, Lefisha malchut harisha'ah, the evil kingdom, which in the case of Rabbi Yishmael would be Rome, Gazra aleinu, has decreed, la'abed mimenu asara chachmei Yisrael. This is a reference to what we come to know as Asara Harugei Malchut, to the 10 notable martyrs who ostensibly were executed by the Romans. Okay? Parenthetically, you should know that not all of the 10 who are mentioned in one or another version of the Midrash or the Piyut were martyred. They didn't all live at the same time, and those who were martyred were not all martyred by the Romans. So it's not an historical Midrash or an historical Piyut, but it's certainly based on historical facts. Okay, so Rabbi Yishmael tells the angel Gabriel that the Romans have decreed the death of these 10 sages, okay? Va'aliti leida, and it's my intention to come up to heaven, leida hagzera, im himeet hakadosh baruch hu, to determine whether this is God's will. Amarlo Gabriel, the angel Gabriel answers as follows. Yishmael b'ni, he says, chen nafshecha, he says, I'm swearing to you. Shakach shamati me'achorei pargod. The pargod, so to speak, is the curtain, right? The curtain beyond which man cannot see, the curtain beyond which man cannot go. That is to say, where God abides, okay? So sometimes if you're standing outside the curtain, you can hear what's going on. So me'acharei shamati me'acharei pargod means that he has it on good authority. And what does he have on good authority? She'asara chachmei Yisrael nimseru lahariga biyad malchut harisha'ah. That indeed it is God's will that these 10 sages be martyred. Amar Rabbi Yishmael lama. What did they do to deserve this? Amarlo, and according to the Midrash, the answer is Al Mechirat Yosef Shemecharuhu Echav. That here we are. We're in the the second century of the Common Era. Okay? That puts us, I'd say, I don't know, 1,800 years, 1,700, 1,800 years after Yosef's brothers sold him into slavery. And yet, according to this Midrash, we still haven't paid the full price for it. Okay. So this is the notion that is incorporated in this famous slicha, which, as I noted here, is recited by Ashkenazim during the Musaf of Yom Kippurim, and it's recited by Sephardim on Tisha B'Av. And you may recognize it because, as I said, it's a standard feature of the liturgy. And again, you can see that it is an alphabetic acrostic. Here, each stanza begins with a new letter of the alphabet, and therefore it's quite a long poem. It's got to have 22 stanzas, as there are 22 letters in the alphabet, and I've only highlighted small portions of it, again, out of the constraints of time, and assuming that this is certainly not an unknown quantity. Okay, so if we start over here, okay, in the paragraph that begins with the letter Dalet, the evil tyrant addresses the Jewish scholars, and he gives them an instruction. He charges them, Dinu mishpat ze la'ashuro, to judge this case properly, va'al ta'avtu b'chazav la'omro, and not to corrupt the verdict, ki im hotzi'uhu la'amito ula'oro, but to declare a true verdict. And what is the question that he's asking them that requires their adjudication? He's basically quoting a Torah verse. Ki yimatzei ish gonev nefesh me'echav mibnei Yisrael. That if somebody kidnaps a fellow Jew, v'hit amer bo umecharo, and he sells him into slavery, what's the ruling? Haim, the scholars, ke'anulo, they answered with the end of the pasuk. The pasuk says, "Umeit haganavahu," that the punishment for kidnapping a fellow Jew and selling him into slavery, which implies that he's being sold to non-Jews, right, is the death penalty. So what's the response of the evil tyrant? Nam, ayei avotechem asher achihem mecharuhu. So what happened? What was the fate of your ancestors who committed a capital crime by selling their brother Joseph? Okay, L'orchat Yishmaelim Sacharu, they sold him to an Ishmaelite caravan. Uva'ad Na'alayim Netanuhu, that's based on a pasuk in the book of Amos. Al Michram Ba'kesef Tzadik Ve'evyon Ba'avor Na'alayim. I don't really know whether the Yishmaelim gave them a pair of shoes in exchange for Joseph, or whether the 30 shekels they got was the going price for a pair of shoes, or whether in fact the pasuk in Amos is not referring at all to the sale of Yosef, but referring to the activities of some of his contemporaries who were not above selling people into slavery for nothing better than a pair of shoes. But in any event, this is the situation. And as we come down to again, this is but the middle. Right? This is only the stanza beginning with the letter tet. We're not even in the middle of the alphabet. So this is the portion of it that is reflected in the Midrash that we looked at. Tiheh Rabbi Yishmael atzmo, that Rabbi Yishmael was assigned the task of going up into heaven and ascertaining whether this is God's will. So in order to go into heaven, he first had to purify himself. Okay? That put him in a metaphysical state of purity in which he could enter heaven. But how did he get up there in the first place? Hizkir et Hashem besiludim. He did it through his manipulation of the divine name. This is something that is discussed not infrequently in Talmudic literature, in early Midrashic literature, in literature that's called Hechalot literature, which is literature of the very early mystics who speculated on the Hechalot, on the palaces in heaven. You may remember that in the Midrash it says that Rabbi Eliezer managed to ascend up to the 6th level of the Rakia. Right? That's based on a notion that somehow heaven itself is divisible into 7 ascending layers. Right? So Rabbi Ishmael, who was able to ascend to the 6th layer, got up pretty high, right? But he was unable to make it all the way to the top. Okay, so a lot of these notions, as I say, can be found in literature of the Talmudic era and shortly thereafter. So somehow Rabbi Ishmael, as a Kohen Gadol, knew how to manipulate the divine name into such a way that it gave him powers and abilities far beyond those of mortal men. It enabled him to ascend up to heaven. Ve'alala marom, so he was able to ascend into heaven. V'sha'al me'it ha'ish levush habadim, and he was able to ask of the angel Gabriel. V'namlo, who replied, kablu alechem tzadikim v'yedidim, you have to simply accept this edict, you have to accept this decree. Kishamati me'achorei pargod, that same phrase again, right? Because I heard from a voice emanating from the far side of the curtain, ki v'zot atem nilkadim, that somehow you're being held responsible for this. So again, this is a continuing notion throughout Talmudic, Midrashic, and medieval literature, that somehow the full price, the full cost of the original sale of Yosef by his brothers still somehow has not been paid, and that ostensibly every misfortune or tragedy that befalls the Jewish people can be attributed to a degree to the original sale of Yosef. And only because I am, acquainted somewhat with some of the classics of Chazonos, I give you a link here. This paragraph of the Piyut Ela Ezkara, Tihera B'Yishmael Atzmo V'Hizkirat Hashem, happens to be featured in a solo piece by the famous Chazan Helfgot. So if you're interested in adding the dimension of sound to the visual effect of the Piyut, you can, at your leisure, click on the link and enjoy Chazan Helfgot's rendition of it. You might, however, ask if Chazan Helfgot, and it is not an original composition to him, right? I knew of it first as a composition that was famous already in the 30s and the 40s by some of the earlier outstanding Chazanim in America. Why didn't he just start at the beginning with Ela Ezkara? So the answer is because in many versions of the Machzor of Yom Kippurim, because probably this piyut is so long, because it has 22 stanzas of 4 lines each, it was abbreviated. And it focused only on those portions of the piyut that are absent here, that actually describe the instances of martyrdom, naming the martyrs and describing the cruel ways in which they were killed. And in those liturgical pieces that were inserted into the Machzorim, they eliminated the first 8 stanzas. So the piyut that we call Ela Ezkara in many Eastern European and therefore in many early American machzorim for Yom Kippurim only started with Tiher Rabbi Yishmael Atzmo. That may very well explain why Chazan Helfgott and his predecessors devoting themselves to some portion of this lengthy piyut began here rather than at the very beginning. And with that, we arrive at our conclusion for today. Next week, we will, because this is Piyut per Parasha, we'll start with something appropriate for Parashat Miketz. But I will tell you now that we will also then divert our attention to Inyane Diyoma, to something more pertinent for the day. And since it will already be the second day of Chanukah, we'll look at some piyutim that pertain to Chanukah. And if you want to do some prep for piyut, then obviously we're going to have a look at the piyut of Ma'oz Tzur. So I wish you all a Shabbat Shalom for this forthcoming Shabbat, and I wish you all a Chag Urim Sameach for the first 2 nights, and we will be reunited again, Emir Hashem, next Tuesday morning, the morning of the second day of Chanukah. And with that, Lehitraot. Unless, of course, there are any questions. I didn't see, there's nothing apparently in the chat, but the link is there. The link is there. It's a link, the last line in the source sheet. Oh, you want me to put it into the chat? I guess I can do that. Give me 1 second. If I can copy it here, then I suppose I can paste it into the link. There you go. You're now all...
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so do you think that the fact that the Paitanim stuck to these boundaries that they gave themselves and work in terms of following an acrostic, an alphabetic one, or based on their name and so forth, caused them to use language which made them more difficult to understand at times?
Yes. Maybe not nearly as much as a feature that we still haven't focused on yet, but we will focus on it beginning next week, and that is the rhyme. Meaning,
I meant that too. Yeah.
Okay, yes. Meaning to find a letter of the alphabet, to find a word that starts with the appropriate letter of the alphabet is not nearly as difficult, really, as making sure that you can use only words that rhyme with each other. So indeed, yes, the combination of acrostic and rhyme, and also another feature of later piyut that, again, we haven't gotten to yet, and that is that some have an internal rhyme scheme based on the number and sequence of accented and unaccented syllables. So
beyond my pay grade.
Frequently, yes, indeed, that forced them to invent words, to create words so that they would fit the rhyme and the syllable scheme. And indeed, as we've already pointed out, they were held accountable for that by many of their critics.
Thank you.
My pleasure once again. Lehitraot.
תודה רבה, שבת שלום.